Hello, 11th grade. So, I don't know about you guys, but this is our fifth week, starting today, our fifth week of online learning. And I don't really know how I feel about that because it doesn't seem like it's been like that. But I guess that means that we're just setting into a routine with this stuff, which is great. I don't like this as much as you guys do. I'm sure it's just as stressful on us as it is on you guys. And it's a pain. And I'll admit, it's a pain. So I'm going to try to make things easier for us as we try to round out the rest of the semester and survive this month, and we're gonna make it. It's gonna be great. So, all right. So first things first, I want to make sure that before you watch any more of this video, that you have went ahead and you've looked at grade link for everything. Otherwise, you would have just found this video on YouTube, which is fine. But before you watch any of this, make sure that you have read that linked article, but also that you have read the dedication page on your copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So read the dedication page first and then read that article that's linked there. That's just necessary to show you guys that something about Lewis, and I hope that you have picked up on something about his character through that. Just because I think it's very important to understand an author before you read their works, which is some of the things I'm going to go into today as well. But before you watch the rest of this video, just make sure that you have actually read the dedication page and that you have read that linked article. But without further ado, let's go ahead and let's hop into this stuff, and we're going to see what happens from here. So I want to hop over to GradeLink first, just to show you guys what's actually going to be going on this week. You will be reading, starting today, chapters 1 through 4 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, just to get the exposition out of the way. Not that it's worth getting out of the way because it's quite incredible, but you guys need to do that first, and then you are going to complete a reading response for chapters 1 through 4 on this linked Google Doc here. So I'm going to show that to you first, and then I'm going to get into some larger things that we're going to be doing just to get some of this preliminary stuff out of the way so you guys know what you're doing later. So first of all, I put some instructions up here on what you need to do. I'm not going to go through that. You guys should be able to follow this on your own, but basically you're just making your own copy of this document in particular, and then you will be able to use that on your own. And just completely come back to this over and over again. So when you do make your own document, just make sure that you delete this and then click here and just, delete backspace, whatever you've got, and just go up the line there to get rid of that extra space. So unlike what we did with Potter, instead of providing you with some specific questions, your work with these two Narnia novels, with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Magician's Nephew, are going to be more self-directed and mirror kind of what you do for a typical reading card, but it's going to be a little bit different. So you still need to write at least 150 words, and within that 150 words, you, instead of putting a quote above it all, I just want you to integrate whatever significant quote you have from those sets of chapters into this response. So you can make the response about that quote. You can integrate the quote within it. You can talk about something specific here or there. Anything you want to do there, just so long as there is the quote is a part of the actual response itself. But you may write about whatever you wish, provided that it pertains to the ideas of world building that we talked about throughout Harry Potter, a deeper theme, an underlying meaning or message, an analysis of something specific from the reading, or you could even talk about, any of the stuff that we mentioned from Harry Potter, like the big scale stuff. If you want to integrate some Lost Child stuff in there, go for it, because it's definitely there. It's not as intense and not as much of a focus as it was in Harry Potter in these novels, but this is still children's literature, so obviously it's going to be there because authors of children's lit cannot help themselves other than integrating that theme either in a very powerful fashion or a very weaker fashion, but it's going to be there. It's there. Trust me, it's there. It might be there 4 ways, wink, wink, but it's there. So these responses that you're going to be writing are meant to allow you to explore the world of Narnia on your own terms. So I want you to consider writing first, just for you guys that need a little bit more structure with this, to consider writing first about your own thoughts and feelings towards the story, and then explaining why you feel that way in more literary terms and more of a literary analysis. Basically, like, this makes me feel really great, or this makes me feel really happy, and this is why, because Lewis is doing this with this particular character, or Lewis is creating this kind of world, or whatever, you feel that way. So, of course, I'll point out or draw your attention to the aspects of the novel that need further study, so you don't have to worry about that kind of thing. You can if you want to. Like if you want to discuss, if you've got some ideas on the symbolism of the lamppost or the wardrobe or anything, or like you want to analyze the character of the professor, you go right ahead. You can do that kind of thing. But ultimately, all of this is open-ended. If you need help coming up with something or you just need some direction, you can always text me and ask for some help, because I know some of you guys struggle with that open-ended nature of this. So I will still give you some things to look for and some things to write about if you need that. But otherwise, your experience with the reading and responding to it is completely your own, and that's what we're going for here. So basically, I've listed out some stuff here for your first two responses, so you'll just need to, write your response here for today, and then on Wednesday, or after you read chapters 4 through 8, you'll just need to put it there. And that's basically what you'll do. And each time you write a new response, you'll just basically create this new heading, date it appropriately, put that, in there as you see fit. So LWW just means Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because I'm not writing that out every time I need to, and you guys don't have to either for your own sake. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get some introduction material out of the way with this little lecture that I have prepared. So, put me up there, wait on this to come through. It's there. All right, let's proceed. So, obviously, we are starting our study of the Chronicles of Narnia today, and I don't know about you guys, but growing up in the homes that you did, or at least in the lifestyle and the culture that we have, being a more religious one, I would hope that most of you do have some familiarity with the Chronicles of Narnia, whether that's just familiarity with the films that have been made, maybe familiarity with the books themselves, maybe you had someone read them to you or they were gifted to you. I know that the first Narnia film, or at least the first Narnia film in our time with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, came out when I was very young, and I saw the movie not knowing that it was a book series, and then I read the books and fell in love with them. And it's taken me a long time to read all of them, and I will admit I still have not read The Horse and His Boy. I have listened to a radio adaptation of it, but it's just hard for me. But I've read all the other ones, and I love them. But the thing about Narnia is it's not your typical bit of children's literature. And there's some reasons for that we're going to get into today. But basically, what we're going to be doing with Narnia is that you guys are going to be reading these two novels in particular, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was the very first novel in the entire series, and then its prequel, or the prequel to the entire Narnia series, The Magician's Nephew, which I've included the original covers for both of these here, or at least I think this is the original cover. It was the best I could find. But the reason that you're reading them in an unchronological order is because I believe that, any type of media franchise, any type of series should be read in the order that it was originally revealed. Now, this goes back to the ideas of what's the best way to watch the Star Wars series? Well, you should obviously watch the original trilogy first, then the prequel trilogy, and then the new trilogy of 7, 8, 9. Because the narrative, even though that is outside of the time order, the narrative makes more sense that way, because you learn to love the characters here first, and then you see where they all came from, or where Anakin came from, and then you see where everything went after this. And the story threads work better that way. It's a better experience to experience it the way in which it was released, because there's a certain magic to entering Narnia first and not really understanding it, but then reading something else after you've already experienced all of this the first time, because then you have a greater understanding and a greater appreciation for how it all came to be. And it's the same kind of thing with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Marvel films. If you want to watch those in chronological order, that's great and all, but nothing is going to make any sense. You start off with Captain America in the 1940s and World War II, and then you watch Captain Marvel just because it's next chronologically, because it shows up in the 1990s. You're going to be confused as everything, because then you've got to watch 20 more movies before Captain Marvel even shows up again. Captain Marvel is meant to be seen after Infinity War and after Ant-Man and the Wasp, because it makes more sense that way, because Captain Marvel's just introduced in that film in her own movie, and then she shows up, 20 years later, 30 years later, somewhere in, in Endgame. And that just makes more sense. So the point that we're doing this, if you guys have any questions of why we aren't reading Magician's Nephew first, well, it's because it's a greater experience, and this is the way that Lewis originally wrote the novels, and I think we will come to a greater appreciation by reading them in this particular order. So that is my thoughts on that. Now, you might be asking, by looking at this slide, why do you just have an illustration of Lucy and Mr. Tumnus? Now, the reason for that is because the whole reason, or at least the reason, that C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia is because he had a certain image in his head. It's an image that he couldn't get out of his head to save his life. And all it was the picture of a faun, or a satyr, for you more Greek mythology people, of a faun holding an umbrella and carrying a parcel or a package in the snow. It was a beautiful scene, but it was this wacky scene that was in his head, and he couldn't get the image out of his head. So he was like, who is this fella? Where did he come from? Why is he carrying a parcel? Why does he have an umbrella? Where did this image come from for my head? And it is from this imaginary image in his mind that he developed, or started to develop, the entire Narnia series. It's crazy that it all came from this one image in his head, but that's what he said, and whether it's true or not, it's C.S. Lewis, and that's just reveals some quirky side of him that we don't often get to see, because we regard him as this, great spiritual leader of the modern age, and he is. But people are quirky, and I just find that hilarious, and I love that. That's where this all came from, was from this image that he had in his head. All right, so moving on, I'm going to give you some brief historical and author context on the story itself. So, the story was first published in 1950, and World War II was still a very fresh memory after it had ended in 1945, only 5 years ago. People still had, and even children still had some thoughts on the war. And what's really interesting is that, for those of you that know the story really well, the story starts off in a certain way with the kids having to be evacuated from their home because of the German Blitz bombings that we've already learned about when we studied Churchill and, the demon lover and all of that stuff. And so when children first read this, they could really see themselves, or at least the young children who had experienced these evacuations could really see themselves in the lives of the Pevensies, which I think is really interesting that he was writing directly to his audience. So the origins of the story, in addition to this image that he had in his head, when he started to spin the story, it possibly began as a story that he told displaced youngsters in his own home. He'd gather the kids around and they would ask him to tell them a story. And so eventually he started laying the groundwork for, what would become the Narnia series after that. And the other interesting thing about this is, in those stories, there's some people who believe that, or there's some evidence to suggest that in these stories there was the character of this professor. And for those of you that know the story really well, there is the character of the professor in this first Narnia book, and also in Magician's Nephew. And most biographers of Lewis believe that the professor is Lewis himself. The professor shares a lot of character traits of Lewis, and one of the biggest things that's really interesting about the professor is that he doesn't have a wife, and we are led to believe that his wife had died, which Lewis had also experienced. And Lewis himself was a professor as well. Some very obvious lines there. All right. However, this was Lewis's first attempt at writing something for children. And in comparing it to some other great works of children's literature, that is evident in some ways. I'm not saying they're not bad, but there's just some structural things, and there's some things that, like, it should be more refined in certain areas, but we will talk about that. I will talk about that as we move through this. So it was his first work that Lewis ever wrote for children, but it wasn't his first fantasy. Lewis had written his space trilogy by this time, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a trilogy of science fiction books that he wrote because he just didn't like the science fiction that was out there, so he wrote his own science fiction. And then he had also written Screwtape at this time, which is a kind of fantasy, but then his other big fantasy that he had written was The Great Divorce, about the bus ride out of hell into heaven. And so that was his other fantasy that he wrote. So it's not the first time he's played in a fantastic imaginary world, but it is the first time that he ever wrote for children. The final thing that I want to look at is just some additional context on Lewis. So in addition to the professor, Lewis, throughout the novel, in some very subtle ways, includes his own disdain or his own kind of, not his hatred, but he didn't really like the state of modern education. Um, and so he includes that in there. Edmund has some rather nasty comments about his boarding school experience, and Lewis bases those off his own hatred of his experience in boarding school. And he also includes his own understanding of the war, which very much influences a lot of things that are present within the novel. Because some people have even went as far as to say that the White Witch is a parallel for just a fascist dictator that was being fought against during World War II. I don't really ascribe to that kind of thinking, but it's there if you want to go with that. And Lewis, there is some evidence to suggest that Lewis may have been doing that, but ultimately, he just includes his disdain for modern education and his own understanding of the war throughout the novel. Now, moving forward, there's some things that I want to point out just rather quickly, and with some comparison and contrast to Potter and just children's literature in general, because while this is children's literature, it's going to be very different at the same time, because it's a different author and it's a different world that we're living in, and it's also older. So it's going to be a little bit removed from our more modern taste that Potter seems to, whet our appetite for a certain kind of literature. So here are some significant differences between Rowling's writing and Lewis's writing when it comes to children's literature. So first of all, Narnia tends to favor the fantastic over its structure. Rowling built a very structured, very organized world in which, it was built to the highest degree of understanding. If there was a question we had, she could probably understand it through the world that she had built. Lewis doesn't do that in this first Narnia novel. He combines multiple mythologies from different belief systems through all the fantastical characters that you're going to meet. And we're intended to focus on just the meaning of, not the meaning of this all, but just like how it all works together and just like the experience of it all existing peacefully together rather than its believability. It's not a Tolkien world in which there's different languages and there's different classes and species and, politics, just like there is in Rowling's world. It's not like that. It's just kind of all thrown together, and that makes it fantastic and imaginative, and we're just expected to buy into all of that and not question it, because Lewis doesn't care. He's just telling a story for kids, and most oftentimes kids don't care about that unless they're made to care about that. Like, I don't know what sports they play in Narnia, but I don't care because my attention has never been drawn to it. Whereas in Harry Potter, you care about what sports they play because J.K. Rowling invented a whole sport. But Lewis doesn't care about these kind of minute specific details that make up his world. He's just building a world, and sometimes it doesn't make sense, but that's part of why it's so imaginative and wonderful. So oftentimes the world building just isn't present. We just walk into a world and we're like, this is Narnia. This is cool. What, 100-year winter? What, Christmas ain't here yet? Y'all been waiting 100 years? Okay, that's cool. And we just run with it. And that's what we're supposed to do. So it's very different from the children's literature that you have recently experienced. The other thing is that, he tends to favor subtlety over actually defining the characters. Now, he does define his characters, but it's often more through subtle ways than Rowling did. Rowling gave us a name that we could look at, and she gave us, strong motivations and character traits, conflicting characters and contrasting characters. She put somebody like Neville, who's scared of everything, in the house that's supposed to be brave, but we don't see why that is until later on. And so she's masterfully building and developing all these characters and giving us mystery and intrigue, and you're just not going to get that with C.S. Lewis. They're just characters in the story. And they're great, and we will fall in love with them, or I hope you'll fall in love with them, but we learn more about them as the narrative progresses, but there's not as much setup. It's just kind of like, these are 4 kids and their family, and they're leaving their home, and then they somehow end up in Narnia. And that's about that. And that's just kind of how that is. The final thing, one of the bigger things, is that, Narnia is definitely more allegorical over narrative. Now, there is a very strong narrative. It's a very involved story, but it's intentionally written so that the reader or the child that the story is being read to is intentionally meant to take away the deeper meaning from it rather than dive bomb into a study of the characters. And they're not supposed to, they see the characters as who they're meant to be seen, but it's ultimately the choices that play out in the story and what it's supposed to represent. And the deeper meanings that are there. That's what Lewis intends for kids to take away from this. Not that, oh, I've written this awesome character and this great leader and Peter Pevensey, like this awful, traitor and one of the kids. But you guys know the story. I don't know why I'm being cryptic. But anyway, this is just what it is. So it's more fantastic over structure. It has more subtlety over definition, and it is definitely more allegorical over more narrative traits within the story. So just three huge things to think about as you're reading through stuff. And all of these things you can look at in your reading cards as well. If you need something to talk about, you can, do a comparison contrast between it and Potter on these 3 points. Now, going back to this allegorical over narrative bit, we're meant to just hear things, read things, and reflect on them, and then move away from it, or maybe come back to it. And so I have this quote from Aslan that says, "All shall be done, but it may be harder than you think." We could sit here and we could talk about the meaning of this for hours. And I think if we did that, we'd come to some fascinating conclusions on what these, few words actually mean, or how we could apply this to our lives or whatever. But it's a very short statement. It is a very short statement. All shall be done, but it may be harder than you think. But there's just this weight to it. There's this deeper meaning to it that you can just sense. And that is what makes the Narnia books so fantastic, and so regarded as great children's literature. And so I'll just leave that there for you to ponder on that. And I believe we have one last thing to do that I just wanted to point out. So these are the first 4 sentences of the novel, which you guys will be reading. But as we look at this, there's just some things that I want to point out, and just some setup and some basic exposition that Lewis does right here. So let me just read this to you real quick. So once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. McCready and 3 servants. It's very simple. It's very elegant. But through this, we learn that we're going to have 4 main characters. And we can kind of assume that these children are listed in order from oldest to youngest, with Peter being the oldest, Susan next, Edmund being the 3rd child, and Lucy being the youngest. And we're given the setting that they're sent away from London during the war because of the air raids, the German blitz bombings, and that they are sent to the house of some professor. And so we get, in this, we get our characters, we get our setting, we get a reason, that we get our inciting incident, if you will, we get Lewis, and we get the idea that they are being removed from their home. Because our first big theme that we're going to look at, and the theme that you guys can dissect and look at in your reading response if you want to, is the theme of distance. That's our first theme, is that the kids are being distanced from their home, but they're not only being distanced from their home, they're being distanced in some other ways as well. And so I will let you guys look at that and explain that as you wish. I'm going to put this over here so you guys can see that illustration a little bit better. But there's also, within this, there is the theme of risk. It's risky for the kids to evacuate, but it's also risky for them to do some of the things that they're going to be doing throughout these first 4 chapters. And the biggest thing, again, is as you read, I want you to think about where the lost child theme may be. I don't know what is happening here. But as you read, you may want to think about where the lost child theme may be apparent throughout these chapters. It's not as intense as Rowling has it in Harry finding his place, but it's definitely there. And so that's just something for you guys to think about. You can look at these 2 themes in particular. Distance is going to be a much larger factor in these first 4 chapters, but other than that, I am going to stop talking and end this in this video here, and just let you guys start reading. And if you got any questions, just let me know, and I hope to hear from you guys soon.